Justin Hepworth. I'm here with Michael Hepworth, and we are here to talk today about rights along with their moral counterpart. So we often find ourselves in the political world talking about political rights, legal rights, natural rights. People frame them in all kinds of ways, constitutional rights. But we often don't talk about what's truly necessary to keep rights and what a right really entails. If we have a right given to us, it is our position and belief that we have a responsibility given to us as well. And there's current discussion about the internet, free speech on the internet, what that entails, the rights associated with that. And we have some real some current situations to look at with that. So Michael, do you want to share with us a quote from Jordan Peterson and then talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this kind of frames our discussion. He said recently, in speaking about online social media, he said, "I'm afraid that the technology itself facilitates free speech without responsibility, and that might be fatal. If you're in the real world, you have to live with the consequences of what you say. Online, you don't. You can separate your opinions from your fate. So there's nothing really that keeps you on track. There's no responsibility commensurate with your right to free speech." And this, I think, frames this in a way we don't talk about a lot today. We like to talk about free speech, many people thinking it just being absolute, that any restriction to anybody speaking is not appropriate, or some people feel that there should be many restrictions to different kinds of speeches. But nobody's really kind of putting it in the context of when you have the right to speak, what is the associated responsibility to that? Because the right to be able to speak kind of lives and dies with how you handle that responsibility. So he talks about you're not online, you're able to separate your opinions from your fate, which doesn't happen when you're speaking to somebody face to face. And so much of our communication today, where we're just talking to other people, or even communication from groups to people, or from people to groups, or business entities, it all takes place online. And there's that same responsibility isn't felt. They can separate their opinions from their fate, so to speak. So the question we probably have is, what is our responsibility that's commensurate with our right to free speech? What obligations are placed on us in order to maintain that right? How do we use the right to free speech in a responsible manner so that we can continue to retain it? When you're speaking face to face, you kind of get an idea of what that looks like kind of naturally. There's natural boundaries that might be involved. When it's online, what kind of recourse do you have? And can we define it better so that we can better understand our rights with our responsibilities with our rights? And I think this can go beyond free speech. With every right we have, what is our associated responsibility? How do we maintain it so that we can maintain our rights?
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that and helping frame that. I look at it, and we'll dive back, we'll circle back to the free speech side in a minute. But to go a little bit high level, I like to think of the fact that if societies to exist, just from a very basic standpoint, if you want two people to be able to live together and interact together, or millions of people to be able to live and interact together, if someone starts harming a person or a group of people and the harm becomes pervasive enough, in general, society will want to say, let's stop that harm. Society wants to find a way to let people live together. I'm talking about high-level systems. And so when we say, hey, I have a right, the law can't tell me what to do, that may be true from a constitutional perspective, or it may be true if you believe in natural rights or other things. But if you use that, quote, right to harm people and hurt people and do things that harm society, and that there's enough people that do that, eventually the law will step in. and take that supposed right away because too many people are being harmed. And law is a force that's trying to create some level of balance or some ability for a society to exist. Now, law can also be something that people use to try and get power over others. And so the founding fathers recognized this and they said, hey, let's put in some rights to say the government can't do certain things. We'll tolerate certain harms. But pretty quickly, even with the freedom of speech, using that as an example, Thomas Jefferson, third president, passes the Aliens and Sedition Acts, supports those. He puts people in jail that disagree with him, that speak out in opposition to him. And we have this scenario where he was one of the founders. He viewed it as harmful speech, still put people in jail. And over the years, the courts have looked at things and said, actually, there's some speech that's so harmful, you don't have the right to say it. They use the example of you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And what they're saying essentially is responsibility sets bounds. If you want a right to exist, you can't exceed those bounds. You have to exercise things responsibly. And again, if you look at it, society is kind of this whole level of, well, what are the rules? What are the norms? What are the things that make it so a human can interact with a human? What makes it so that we stand in line at the store? There's not a law that says we have to stand in line at the store. There's a very strong social order in America that says you need to stand in line. It's a moral type social order. And we don't generally tolerate people who break in line and go ahead of us. And so America has decided from a moral perspective, first come, first serve. So we do lines and we have this moral responsibility. If we all stopped standing in line and we just negated our moral responsibility to stand in line and we all just went and rushed to the entrance or whatever, we would see if that became a pervasive enough problem, laws would start to step in to regulate that because it doesn't work if everyone's just storming the castle, so to speak. And we saw those issues, a little before COVID. COVID may have been a blessing in disguise for Black Friday. Black Friday had grown to be such a cultural thing that people were, we had a couple of situations where people were trampled with the mad rush to get inside the stores once the doors opened. And once COVID hit, Black Friday changed significantly. And retailers were already looking at ways to change it because they were getting in trouble if people were getting trampled. And the law didn't necessarily come in and say that they were going to provide the solution. They were just telling the retailers they'd be liable for it. But the reason to think about our system and how it works is when we were given rights as a people, those rights came with responsibilities. That's why the founding fathers said, this Constitution is built for a moral people. It's wholly inadequate to govern an immoral people, essentially, because if you give people rights, it's under the presumption that we'll exercise them morally. And the only way to preserve our rights is to exercise them morally. So circling back to Jordan Peterson and what he's talking about, he's saying, look, technology has given people the ability to just say things and have no consequence back in their life, which essentially means there's no responsibility tied to it. I can say whatever and be on an anonymous account or whatever. And I think one of his fears is he's recognizing we might lose our freedom of speech if there's no responsibility or consequence tied to the things we say, because we'll just start saying horrible things and doing horrible things. And we see that. We've felt this influence from the internet where we go, ooh, there's a lot of bad things coming from people. Even groups like Facebook, we get so upset at Facebook for what we call censoring, removing content. And I'm not here defending Facebook necessarily, but Facebook, to make it family friendly enough for people to use it, they have to pay large groups of people to go through and remove all kinds of content. People will post very violent, very criminal type content. They'll post rapes, they'll post different things, videos of these things. And this content has to get flagged, whether it's AI flagging it or human flagging it. And then there's someone that has to view it and determine it's bad. And most of Facebook's content moderators are in Africa. It's a horrible job. It takes an incredible toll on their psyche. But people do post horrible things. And if that goes unchecked, if Facebook doesn't check it, at some point the harms may become enough that the law steps in and says, hey, enough is enough. And we're seeing this a little bit with teens and social media. There's currently a lot of pressure on judges to allow liability against social media companies when there's suicidal type videos posted or violent videos posted that encourage violence or suicide or different things. And there's a federal law in place that says social media platforms are basically like a website provider. They're not liable for what someone puts on the website. They're just providing a tool, kind of like your phone. If I call and say something evil, the phone provider is not liable. They don't have to scan everything I say and block it. But since the social media platforms do remove things, they're not just like a phone company that lets anything through. They are removing things because some things can be seen publicly and shared publicly. People are trying to sue to say they're involved in content moderation, and they should be liable for things they don't take down. But again, this battle is part of this bigger question about responsibility. And with the technology that exists, instead of pushing to hold the poster responsible, the person that posted it responsible, we're pushing to hold big companies responsible, which, if we do, will result in far greater content regulation because we're not taking responsibility and tying it to the actual poster. If someone posts a bad video that shows a criminal act or violence or any of those things, we should hold them responsible. And part of us says, we have freedom of speech. We can't hold these people responsible. But I think that the notion is once we start to separate rights from responsibilities, the whole system starts to break down. And we try and transfer those responsibilities elsewhere to other people in the corporate world. But the whole thing starts to break down and gets worse and worse over time.
And there's also a question of scale. I think you see this in most places where we cease living our responsibilities with our rights. If there's enough people and there's enough harm, the government as constituted, and any government as constituted, doesn't really have the ability to go to each individual and specifically target a single thing that they do. There's too much overhead involved in that. So instead, more sweeping policy is created, such as you're discussing about targeting social media companies. And it affects far more people, but that's the only way the government has to act. The government is a kind of a big blundering force, and it can't be a scalpel. It's going to be a sledgehammer. And so the more individuals are participating in irresponsible behavior under the guise of rights, the more that kind of sledgehammer comes into play, and it just spreads the force across society as a whole. And so individuals that are living responsibly will be affected, and individuals that aren't living responsibly will be affected. But there's just no way for a government to be a scalpel and pull it all out. That's where society really has to step up and say, what are our moral values and how are we going to live responsibly? Because the government isn't going to be able to do that at an individual level.
Yeah. And as part of that, when we talk about responsibility, I know that it can feel disheartening to people, maybe even depressing to people to say, oh, well, if people aren't going to be moral, our whole society falls apart. And then they feel kind of helpless to go, well, I can't control people, so things will just fall apart. Austin, if you're telling me there's no chance, for society to exist. But the thing I've found is it's pretty interesting. If you're willing to speak up and say that something's wrong, it's actually how morality is enforced. It's actually very hard for most humans to continue doing something that's bad when someone's telling them, hey, that's wrong, you can't do that. And I'll give a few examples of this. I remember shortly after I got married, I worked at a silver refinery. There's a bunch of tough guys there. And there was one just very large man. He was incredibly strong. Just way bigger than me. Probably he was over twice my weight, but he wasn't an overweight guy. He's just full of muscle, really tall, really strong. And he made a joke. It was an inappropriate joke, about the fact I just got married. And I remember being just this younger kid. I was 22 or something at the time. Looked at him and I just said, "That's not funny." And his whole demeanor changed, and he apologized. And he felt really sheepish. And I remember watching this really big guy feel super sheepish and going, he could have smashed me. But I stood up and said, that's not funny. And it was in a way that's pretty clear that it's inappropriate. And then my wife became very concerned about the magazines that they were putting in grocery stores, because she'd walk by with our young children. And it was really interesting to see. She started, every time she went in the grocery store, she'd say to the cashier, she'd say, that magazine there is pornographic. Can you take it down? And virtually all of them would get super embarrassed. Like, oh, I'm so sorry. I can't make that decision. I don't like it either. And she'd say, well, can I talk to your manager? And then she would just hold up the line at the store. While the manager came over, and she'd say, that magazine's pornographic. Will you please take it down? And these stores started taking the magazines out. And the stores actually changed and told the magazine supplier, they have these magazine vendors that come in and supply things. They told them, you can't keep bringing these certain magazines in. We're getting too many complaints. It was my wife complaining. She was holding up the line. It was one person taking a moral stand and saying, hey, this isn't right. I need you to do something about this. She wasn't yelling at them. She wasn't threatening them with anything. But when you turn to someone and say, that's pornography, it's not appropriate to be here or in front of kids, people have a very hard time not doing something at that point. And it took a number of times. Sometimes they'd go and take the magazines down, or they'd put a cover up or different things. But eventually they just got tired of it and took them out of the store. And so the thing that we have to realize with a moral perspective is it's kind of like the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. I believe very strongly that they wrote that to teach us the power of our word, the power of standing up for something. When the little child at the very end says, the emperor's not wearing any clothes, everyone suddenly realized, yeah, they're right. They didn't have anything else to say in response. And so the reason that we talk, and that we're going to talk about in more detail about some of our responsibilities about this morality side of things, is because morality stays alive by being spoken. And we as Americans have to have the courage to speak it. We have to say, that's not right. Hey, Facebook user, don't treat people that way. That's wrong. Whatever it is, hey, here in my house, we don't use those words. Morality is enforced by letting someone know they've done something inappropriate. And in our world today, I think that sounds very scary to a lot of people. But that gets us into another topic associated with this, faith versus fear. And we'll go into that in just a minute. But Mike, I want to check before we move on to the faith versus fear. kind of what leads us. Is there anything you want to add to the discussion on morality and the power of the spoken word in helping to enforce morality?
Yeah, not to hit, I guess, on quotes from Jordan Peterson too much, but when you were talking, it just reminded me of another one that I had heard him talk about how we do good and how good is done in the world. And he said, I believe that the good that people do, small though it may appear, has more to do with the good that manifests itself broadly in the world than people think. And I believe the same about evil. We're each more responsible for the state of the world than we believe or would feel comfortable believing. Without careful attention, culture itself tilts towards corruption. Tyranny grows slowly and asks us to retreat in comparatively tiny steps, but each retreat increases the possibility of the next retreat. He says further, it should be remembered that it is rare for people to stand up against what they know to be wrong, even when the consequences for doing so are comparatively slight. So he kind of gives the same idea that we don't like to think about it that way. We like to think that having a big impact requires a big corporation or a big footprint online or something along those lines. But it really comes down to how you behave every day and the things that you say. Like you say, morality is sustained by what we say, what we do, how we act, and you can make a big difference both for good and for evil by speaking out or staying silent, by retreating because you feel a little uncomfortable. But if you speak out, the consequences for that are comparatively slight, as it said in the quote. But we so rarely do so. We fear so much consequences that really aren't to be feared. And really, the sustaining of morality comes down to what we say and what we do.
Yeah, and it's this fascinating thing I've started to look at with, if you ask the question of why are we losing our rights? And I'd say I actually believe the biggest contributor to the loss of our rights currently is we fear the responsibility we have. We're afraid of it. We're afraid to speak out. We're afraid to say something. We're afraid to go, I actually really struggle with that candidate or these other things. We have this spirit of fear that guides us. And when we live by a spirit of fear, we don't do things that are right. When we don't do things that are right, the moral code starts to die. The fabric of society withers. And it's a common belief. We look at the rich, we look at the influencers, we say, oh, if they would just say this, the world would be so much better. And what we're doing in that scenario is we're actually shirking responsibility. We're placing the blame on someone else for society. We're adopting a victim type mentality. But instead, if it's, I actually need to speak up. Now, again, it doesn't mean I have to become violent or angry or mean. Those are things we shouldn't become. Enforcing morality, saying, that's not funny, or standing in line and saying, that magazine's pornographic. It doesn't require this craziness. It doesn't require being boisterous. It doesn't require any of that. And to your point, did I suffer a societal consequence? Was I kicked out of my job because I said, hey, that's not right? Was my wife banned from the store because she said that was pornographic? No. And she had to go through the discomfort of standing there with some people upset that they were waiting longer in line. But at the end of the day, that's a very short-term discomfort, and it's gone very quickly. But we fear people's judgments so much that we're going, oh, I'm not going to say anything because it will cause a stir and people will be frustrated. When in reality, when we stand up and say something, it can give life to something. It can actually inspire other people to do the same thing. There's a lot of people that don't enjoy the magazines and stories. And speaking up helps a lot of people. And there becomes a moral code that starts to be enforced. And I remember even on the pornography side, there was a billboard put up in Salt Lake once. And from my point of view, it was very inappropriate. very sexual based in nature, very inappropriate image on it. And every billboard here has a number on it. There's a billboard number below. So I wrote down the billboard number, I called the billboard company and I said, hey, I'm complaining about a billboard that I think is pornographic. And the man goes, oh, he says, well, we take these complaints very seriously. Do you know the billboard number? And I said, yep, here it is. And he looks it up and he goes, oh, okay. He goes, I can see your concern. He says, but he says, we always judge what's right or wrong based off community standards. And he says, you're the only person that's filed a complaint about this billboard. And I remember sitting there thinking, I live in an area that's supposed to be highly religious, that's supposed to not love these things, and they probably don't. People probably don't appreciate the sign, but no one had said anything. And so he said, yeah, he goes, I get your feeling, but we kind of go off community standards to determine what is or isn't appropriate. So unless there's more complaints, we won't do anything about this billboard. And that was one of the points where I really started to think about the power each of us has to say, we have the option to call up. Yeah, sure, it takes an extra couple minutes. You got to get a billboard number, whatever. But we have the power to shape our communities. If you let the billboard companies know that something's not appropriate and appreciated and enough, even 10, 15 people call in, that is telling them there's a problem because they kind of assign a certain, they say if one person calls in, it represents at least 1,000 people in the way they feel. And they do take these things very seriously. And it may be that one person needs to speak up or 2 people or 3 people, but it doesn't take millions, like you say, Michael. It doesn't take millions of dollars. And our rights depend on us stepping up. Because if we don't self-regulate, if we don't enforce morality in our community, the only option becomes for the law to do it. If the law starts enforcing morality and self-regulating, it's a political battle and it becomes tyrannical. The law is now dictating everything. We're no longer a society that gets to self-regulate. The law is telling us what to do or not to do in those situations. And so with that, again, circling back to the spirit of fear versus the spirit of faith. The spirit of faith says, I'm going to do the right thing regardless of the outcome. Maybe I'll lose my job if I say that's not funny. Maybe there will be a consequence, but I'm willing to go through the consequence because I know it's the right thing. That's faith. Faith isn't that nothing bad will happen. It's just that you need to do it and move on and figure life out. Fear is, oh shoot, I might lose my job. Oh, I might lose a friend. Oh, I might lose this or that or the other. And when we make fear-based decisions, in general, everything gets worse and worse and worse, and we start spiraling downward. And I believe that as America, we feel our society starting to go down more and more because many of us are embracing this fear-based mentality of, I can't offend someone, no, I can't say anything. And again, I'm not here saying we should yell at them, we should call them names. But I am saying we should say, that's not right. If there's a parent yelling at the coach at a basketball game, say, hey, it's not okay to yell at people. They may not stop in that moment, but they're going to think about it after. It's going to impact them. And these things change. But if we just all sit there and say nothing, they keep doing it. And then other people do it because it's viewed as acceptable if no one steps in and says, that's wrong. And again, in the balance, we talk often about this balance of morality, law. It's kind of this notion of liberty is a balance between anarchy and tyranny. And to pull it up here, just to make sure that we share it, at least for those on the video. it's really important to understand that laws pull us out of anarchy. Morality keeps us from tyranny. If we want liberty, we have to live our morality. That's our responsibility. So if there's a right, the right means that on the balance side of things, there's not a law telling us what we have to do because we have a right to live our own life. But that right can only exist if we are living it responsibly. If we become irresponsible with it, it will be lost. All rights that are not lived responsibly will be lost. If we want a right to, bear arms, technically, if we want that for Second Amendment purposes, for example, then if we're just out shooting and people are just shooting all the time and you can walk outside safely because there's just bullets flying everywhere, society would step in and say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And so there is this notion of there has to be some responsibility. There has to be some self-restraint imposed with the right to bear arms. You can't just shoot a gun all the time, anywhere. You have to have self-restraint. And you need to do something to make sure that that's strongly enforced within, those that have guns. There needs to be norms. There needs to be things in place that aren't laws. It's a moral code, but it allows people to operate and work so that right can be maintained. And and again, it's the same with speech, it's the same with religion. If you get crazy with your religion and you're doing all kinds of wild things, you're harming people, you're hurting people, those rights will start to be lost. And rights exist within the framework of morality.
And just real quick clarification on when we say, we need to not fear, we need to have faith. That's not to say, we sometimes conflate fear with caution. It's not to say don't be cautious and don't be respectful. But it's to say you can't fear the outcome of standing up for something you believe to be right. That's when we're talking about fearing, you need to have confidence in moral decisions and don't be afraid of the consequence of standing up for what you believe is right. Obviously, we need to act with prudence and caution in everything that we do, but do not fear that when I stand up for something I believe to be morally right, I can't go into that fearing the outcome, or else I won't go into it at all. At the end of this quote by Jordan Peterson, he says, "This is something to deeply consider if you are concerned with leading a moral and careful life. If you do not object when the transgressions against your conscience are minor, why presume that you will not willfully participate when the transgressions get truly out of hand?" So if it's just minor things and the consequences are light and you don't do anything about it, why do you believe you're going to do something when the transgressions get worse and the consequences get worse if you couldn't do it before? So the time to stand up is now. It's time to stand up and stand up for those things you believe to be morally right, and don't be afraid of the outcome.
And I like that discussion. I remember once talking to someone and they were appalled this rich person had stolen, I don't know, they had defrauded a company out of $1 million or something. And they go, I would never sell my, my soul or my honesty for $1 million. And I remember sitting there at the time and just having this thought come to me, because the person had just been telling me how they had found this cool new app. It was back in the, I forget the name of it. When music first came online, Napster, was that what it was called or something? They had the music app where you could essentially pirate music. And they had just finished telling me how cool it was. They just gotten all this free music. But they would never sell their stuff for $1 million. And I remember just kind of turning back and I said, but you would do it for 5? Like, why is your honesty, and you know it's wrong to take that music, you know that it's, it's these These people knew that they were downloading songs that they should have paid for. And it was okay because it was only $5 or $10. But then they believed they wouldn't do that if there was $1 million to gain from it. And I think to your point, people go, oh, I'm going to draw the line at $1 million. I would never be dishonest for $1 million. If you're dishonest for 10, you'll be dishonest for $1 million if that opportunity presents itself. Because why not? You cross the line for 10. And so people do laugh at people that choose to be honest and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I need to pay for it or whatever. But that's how you maintain a moral line. And in our country today, and the way our country works, the way our society works, is we actually have a lot of power and influence as people. The things we say impact others. And that sets a whole system of norms in place. If we're silent, we're letting those norms slip away. Things break down. Why are so many bad things happening? Well, we may not be speaking up enough. And again, like you say, Michael, it's not to say that we're there just, saying don't use any caution and don't use any wisdom with how you say things. But to not fear that outcome, to not let that be the controlling force to say, well, what if this happens? Well, what if? And I remember as I reflected on fear, I was in charge of a church congregation, a small congregation. It wasn't the whole congregation, it was a small subset of the congregation. And we had a class specifically that I was in charge of where this group of men would meet for this class. And we had a couple of people in it that said some very inappropriate things. And at church, you get a little nervous about offending someone or having them leave. You're going, I don't know if, what if it's my fault? They don't come back to church, and then will that be on me? Will it not? Kind of thing. And that's a deep fear often that's there. And so I remembered struggling, going, man, these guys say very inappropriate things. They drive the spirit away that's trying to be achieved at church. And the attendance in the class was dwindling very far. It was down to just 6 or so people left. And I remember finally one day saying, I need to say what's right. I need to tell them that what they're saying is inappropriate and ask them to stop. And if they stop coming to church, that's on them. That's not my fault if I approach it in the right, from the right perspective. So next time in class, when they said something inappropriate, this one in particular, I remember, I said, that's not appropriate. We don't say that here at church. And true to the fear, he stopped coming. He was offended by that. But the people started coming back to class. We had so many people start coming back to class once the problem was addressed and the morality was restored to say, we don't tolerate that here. That's not okay. And it was just a word spoken. It wasn't in anger. And there is a happy ending in the sense that he did eventually come back. He was probably gone for about 6 months. But he changed. He didn't say the same things because we'd made it clear that's not acceptable here. And I was interested by that experience to say, I often am we're afraid of offending someone or whatever, but that person's offending everyone. And why are we more afraid of the offense to the one when there's an offense taking place to 100? Why don't we address the breach of morality with the one to rectify the offense to the 100? And fear causes us to think more of that, the rule breaker, and kind of what they feel as opposed to what everyone else is feeling. It's one of the things I view even as we talk about, as society talks about girls' sports, transgender competition in it. They talk about how, well, if you're transgender and you're male gone to female, you need to be with the females to feel comfortable. But we ignore the fact that, well, now every female in the locker room feels very uncomfortable, potentially. And again, we're equating one person's feelings versus a large group feeling. And I think that We need to be very able to talk about the issues and the things and stand up for things, express our moral opinion on things. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's no place for a transgender person to compete with girls, or I'm not saying that they have to. Just that the discussion about, well, they feel uncomfortable with the boys, so they should be with the girls. I go, well, that's not the principle we should go on, because all those girls feel uncomfortable too. And we have to dive deeper. We have to look at what's the actual moral, principle that we are going off of here. But it is to go back to understanding that our fears can tell us potential consequences, and those might happen. You might lose a job, but I found that for most people that lose a job for standing up for the right thing, they tend to find an even better one and a place where they're a better fit. You know, the church class improved once I stood up and said, that's not appropriate. We don't say that here. And it improved for everybody. Even for the person that eventually came back, it was an improvement. There was more to gain from that. Now there's still the consequence of they did leave for a time. And so the fear was true in a sense that that might happen. Now our fears aren't always true. They often project the worst case scenario. But approaching it with an eye of faith is to say, if I live morally and responsibly, in the end, things work out far better than if I didn't. Fear is to say, just keep things nice right now. We'll deal with the future later. We'll never deal with the future later if we just keep things nice right now. We have to be moral people. That's our responsibility. And so to us, America is built on this balance. We're given rights. That means the government isn't supposed to come in and regulate, which means that duty, that responsibility rests on us. We have to exercise that. And we have to realize that our actions actually have a very large impact very quickly. We may not see it with our eyes because there may not be a Facebook account with 10,000 likes associated with it. But our conduct and our actions and the things we say greatly, greatly contributes to the state of America and the state of our society. And we have far more power than most of us like to accept or believe, because it's easier just to blame others. But when we accept responsibility, we realize I do have something. I do play a part in this. And all of these actions aggregated together do really put things in motion. The things I say, the things I do can influence someone else for good or bad. And that will then influence someone else. No man's an island. It's another way to look at it. So we'll continue talking quite a bit about some of the morality associated with America. We want to dive into certain moral principles that we believe are foundational to our system. They're things we have to live, and we're not even talking necessarily about what God you worship or something like that. We're just talking about the deep morality that's ingrained in America, similar to standing in line. It's one of the morals we have here. You stand in line. I'm not talking about a universal moral in that scenario. Now, some of them people may believe are universal morals, some they may not. But we're going to really try and look at America, what's made it what it is, and say this is the morality that's defined America. This is what's starting to break down. Jordan Peterson talked about the morality of speech, how before you were accountable for your own speech, there was something that came back to you. And now there's not. Now, there is a little bit I would disagree with on that, just to be fair. The founding fathers, many of them with the Federalist Papers, wrote anonymously. They didn't have full consequences come back for them by writing anonymously. And so even before the internet, anonymous speech did exist. But I do think there was some level of morality check to it still, where the newspaper probably wouldn't publish it if it were too far outside the bounds of decency. But the founding fathers were certainly willing to be responsible for what they were doing. They signed the Declaration of Independence. Their lives were on the line. There was a lot of responsibility tied to it. So it's still a good place to look, and something to understand. And there may be a place for some level of anonymity in certain things, even online. But part of the balance is us setting up, as we're going to talk about morality, how do we keep responsibility generally tied to people so that these rights can exist? Michael, do you have any other thoughts or things you'd like to follow up on?
No, just in general, you talked about anonymity behind when we say things. That's probably when we get into more of these moral values and we try to decide how we protect them. You can try to look for principles like with anonymity. If you are saying something anonymously, it's probably a good indicator that you should be very careful. It basically means I'm going to be relieved of responsibility for this. And so you could ask yourself questions like, would I say this if I was talking to the person face to face? Or things along those lines, just to help you be more careful in what you do. And I think as we talk about more of the moral principles undergirding America, we can try to identify what are some guardrails? What are some guardrails we've had in the past? What are some we can try to re-implement or create new, just as ways to help us live our responsibilities associated with our rights.
Yeah, and we'll certainly try and focus on some of those, but it'd be interesting too for any of you listening as you think about it. Share ideas with us. We're not all knowing. We don't pretend to be. And it's really neat to see people's ideas on ways to have checks and balances or these guardrails. Because just as our government needs checks and balances, we as a people need our own internal checks and balances. We can't just let vices go unchecked. We can't just pretend that, oh, I'm only doing this in private. If we're selling ourselves out short in a small moment or private moment or an anonymous moment, we would do it in a bigger moment too. It's just the way that these things go. If our honesty is not worth $5 to us to actually purchase the song, then it probably isn't worth $1 million to us either, as those opportunities come. So we look forward to talking more about this morality side of the balance, the rights and responsibilities. But remember that when you say you have the right to do something, just have it come into your mind too. That means I have the responsibility. I need to use this in the right way. And if we can look at things that way and work that way, liberty can thrive. Even if some people choose to be immoral, we can still thrive as a country by each embracing and living according to what we need to do and what we should be from a moral and responsible perspective. So thanks for joining us today, and we will follow up more on these discussions next week.